Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have That Was You, GOP lawmaker hit with blunt reminder of his own words on live TV from HuffPost.com, posted by CH4Locks, and yeah, personally, it just goes to show you how hypocritical a lot of these politicians are. They'll say one thing and then do the opposite, and that just goes to tell you, a lot of people don't have values or principles when it comes to politics. They only have teams, as I seem to say in every episode of these podcasts these days. If their team does something, it's completely justified. But if the other team does something, it's the worst thing ever. And that just goes to show you how you gotta question your party as well as the other party. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have major win for Trump as Congress passes big beautiful bill from BBC.com, posted by Doctor Who 07. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the bill. I think it's just typical Republican fare that they say it's gonna cut taxes, cut spending, and all that. But I think it might cut some taxes, but it's not going to cut spending. And that just goes to show you how the Republicans are just like the Democrats. They'll spend like there's no tomorrow, even if they might mark themselves as being different, especially when they're out of positions of government power. And that just goes to show you how both branches of the Uniparty are really the same thing, even if they like to market, even if the TV and Reddit market themselves as being extremely different. Then we have, so now that we've seen how 200 plus years of unconstitutional laws layered on top of the Constitution have given imposed unprecedented powers, what powers do we strip away permanently? Posted by Plasman 30, and they said, 1. The power to levy tariffs under any circumstances should be relegated to Congress, like it was when they passed the Constitution. 2. Military action should only be allowed with congressional approval 100% of the time, unless there is a direct attack on U.S. soil and Congress is unable to assemble, like what was when they passed the Constitution. 3. Executive orders need to stop having the force of law, like when it was when they passed the Constitution. 4. POTUS should not have control of National Guard units. Under George W. Bush, Congress made the National Guard POTUS' own personal army. 5. States need to create their own militias and use them instead of the National Guard. I know many states already have their own militias, but this should be more commonplace. And I would agree with all that. The problem is that the Constitution, it says a lot of good stuff, but you can't really enforce it. Ultimately, a lot of people just defer whatever the president says or does, even if it goes against the Constitution. And that's been like that way for centuries now. Almost 200 years ago, Andrew Jackson openly disregarded the Supreme Court and ended the Trail of Tears even after they told him to not do the Trail of Tears. So it just goes to show you how it doesn't matter. Laws don't really matter what's written on a piece of paper. What matters is how they are enforced. And ultimately, the president is often given the discretion to justify interpreting the law however he feels like, even if it's not what's written down on the piece of paper. And that goes to show you how the Constitution might have been a good idea, but ultimately, since there's no method to really enforce it, eventually the president just kind of becomes a king, and you're seeing the effects of that these days. And I would argue is mostly just the figurehead king, kind of like the one they have in the UK, because the power really doesn't lie with them. The power lies with whoever is their advisors are, like the military industrial complex or the deep state. Those guys are probably the ones really running the country. The president's just there to distract from the people and the media. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Bible Belt theocrats are an embarrassment to the school choice movement. And that's a YouTube video posted by Simeon. That's a YouTube video from Genetically Modified School Skeptic, and then the video is entitled "Joe Rogan's Lies Just Destroyed Public Schools in Texas." And then Simeon added under the video, "With friends like Baptists, who needs enemies?" And with the utter failure of public schools in teaching the free arts, school choice is a worthy goal, but not choices are run by superstitious idiots obsessed with Bronze Age religion, badly translated English to justify their bigotry. And yeah, personally, I think, if people do want to have religious schools, I think that's fine. But I think the problem with school choice is that people want it to be government funded, even for the religious schools. And I think the libertarian position is, if people want to pay their voluntarily send their tax dollars to pay for public schools or religious schools, they should be able to do so, or any schools they want to. But the problem is, I think, the school is an inherently authoritarian institution that's gonna indoctrinate children into their biases and ideologies, and that just goes to show you how the schools should be teaching kids to think for themselves, but a lot of schools don't do that these days, and that just go and yeah, so personally, I think people should be able to fund whatever schools they want to, but right now you're pretty much forced to fund public schools through school taxes. Well, in some instances, you might be forced to fund private schools and religious schools as well through school taxes, but not nearly as unanimously. So I think the libertarian position is, if you want to fund a public school, great, you can fund a public school. If you want to fund a private school, fund a private school. If you want to fund a religious school, fund a religious school, but you shouldn't be forced to fund anything that you don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump will put the farmers in charge when deciding to deport undocumented ag workers from DesMoinesRegister.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the centrist subreddit. And yeah, ultimately, I think if the government shouldn't be deporting anyone, regardless of how horrible they are, because ultimately, I don't think the government should be able to use force for any reason whatsoever. I think everyone else. I'm always critical of the government's monopoly on the use of force, and I think everyone should be able to use force for whatever reason they feel like. But ultimately, when you have the state having monopoly on the use of force, they can justify using force for whatever reasons they feel like, and there's ultimately no one who can stop them. With that being said, if the government wants to put the farmers in charge of who gets deported and who doesn't, that's on them. As I said, they have the monopoly on the use of force. They can justify doing whatever they feel like, pretty much. And people have pretty much no recourse to stop them because they control the monopoly use of force and the court system as well. Then we have No Other Word Dementia, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross post from the Boomers Being Fools subreddit, WTF 2 billion farms in Iowa. And yeah, I think that was Donald Trump just kind of misspeaking or using hyperbole. But of course, on Reddit, any misstep he has is going to be literally Hitler. So of course, Reddit, it's pretty much been Orange Man bad for almost 4,000 days now at this point, it seems. And yeah, if Redditors want to post Orange Man bad, that's fine. But when you have no other values besides Orange Man bad, don't be surprised when people aren't very thrilled about your own party. That's pretty much why Kamala Harris lost. She had no other political positions other than Orange Man bad, and nothing else. No one else could really say what else she stood for besides that. And yeah, you can only say Orange Man bad so much before realizing these people have nothing. And yeah, I don't really care for Donald Trump. But the thing is, when you go Orange Man bad every single day for over a decade, eventually people are going to start toning it out, and that's what I see kind of Reddit. Every headline's Orange Man bad this, Orange Man bad that. I don't really care for the guy, but eventually just start toning it out. Then we have, did Republicans canceling NOAA contribute to 23 deaths in Texas, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross post from the Midas Touch subreddit. And, you can make the argument that it did, but, the problem with Reddit is, like a lot of people these days, they always try to politicize every tragedy because Orange Man bad, as I said, If you want to think that the Republicans gutting NOAA is responsible for all these deaths, that's fine. But whenever you try and politicize a tragedy to fit your agenda, people are gonna see that very cynically and skeptically, and you eventually start to realize that these people they don't have any values. They just want to politicize everything to fit their agenda. Republicans kind of do that as well, but they're not the ones who post to the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Most of the Libertarian Censored subreddit are either DNC shills or outright Marxists, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, what will be the long-term effects of the huge increase in state police, posted by Fast Seaworthiness 739, and they said, Congress just passed and the President signed a bill greatly increasing the size and scope of the state police. What will be the long-term effects? Smaller workforce, less liberty. And yeah, personally, I don't think it will change too much. Just because the police are greater in size doesn't mean, that they'll be more effective. Ultimately it means, there might be more of them, but other than that, I don't think too much is going to change. Reddit's always like, the world's ending, this is the worst thing ever, but you eventually realize nothing ever really happens, and Reddit, just like the traditional media that came before it, is prone to constant hyperbole and sensationalism. Then we have, to fight Trump's funding freezes, states propose a new gambit withholding federal payments, from NBCNews.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, if states want to freeze federal funding for whatever reason, I think that's very much states' rights, and I'm very big on states' rights, and people will justify what they justify. But people don't like Trump's funding freezes and want to freeze their own funds as a result, ultimately people will justify what they justify, hopefully something will come of it, but nothing usually ever seems to happen. Even when there's like a government shutdown, the police are still operating, the school buses schools are still operating. It's pretty much just false advertising, and that just goes to show you that everything is gonna be everything. Reddit always, social media always like the doom post, but nothing ever really happens, and yeah, it just goes, that's my thoughts there. So yeah, if they want to withhold payments for whatever reason, that's fine, but don't be surprised if people don't really care for that. Then we have Elon Musk says he's created his own political party, the America Party, from news.sky.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I'm probably going to stick with the Libertarian Party, but if the American Party runs any small libertarian candidates, I might cross over and vote for them, especially if there isn't any libertarian candidates on the ballot, Libertarian Party candidates on the ballot. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Sweden bans AR-15 as hunting rifle after school shooting. All rifles be turned in and sent to Ukraine, from svt.se, posted by Common Sense, and that's cross-post from the Europe subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think the state should be banning any weapons for whatever reason. If the state can ban one weapon, it can ban all weapons. So that just goes to show you how, Sweden's usually probably one of the better European countries when it comes to gun rights, and even they're starting to go back on them. So that just goes to show you how you can't trust the government, even if it's one of the better ones on the continent. I complain a lot about the U.S. when it comes to their authoritarian government, but a lot of the West, and particularly Europe, has even worse authoritarian governments that will arrest you for posting memes that they disagree with, and that just goes to show you how it's a scary world out there. Just because your government isn't too good doesn't mean that the grass is greener on the other side, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have Musk announces forming of America Party in further break from Trump, from Reuters.com, posted by Grass Tastes Bada, and they added, I'm skeptical if this will actually happen, let alone have any success, but anything that draws support away from Trump is good in my opinion. And I guess I would agree with that. Hopefully, hopefully this party might be the one to break the duopoly. But it kind of reminds me of like Ross Perot from like 30 years ago or something. Ross Perot said, "I'm gonna break the duopoly," and he did pretty well. But he didn't break the duopoly, and I think that might be the American Party ceiling. It might just be like the Reform Party, where they get like 5 to 10% of the vote and hand the election over to the Democrats. And that just goes to show you how it doesn't really it's really hard to break the duopoly because it's always going to be seen as handing over the election to one of the two major parties, and that's just why I don't know if we'll ever break in my lifetime, but we can only hope. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Deadly Curval Texas Flood, posted by Dina B. Free, and they said, I keep hearing people say that the short staffing of the National Weather Service prevented flood warnings from going out. I'm no fan of the current administration, but I don't think we can lay this one on them. Here's what I've gleaned from reading several different news sources, these times vary slightly. NWS issued a flood watch on Thursday afternoon at 1:18, predicting 7 inches of rain. NWS issued a flash flood warning at 1:14 a.m. on Friday morning, and NWS issued a flash flood emergency at 4:03 a.m. on Friday morning, Kerrville City posted a warning on Facebook at 6:16 a.m. in the morning. Friday morning. According to the Texas Tribune, an employee of NWS said we had adequate staffing, we had adequate technology. Weller said this was us doing our job to the best of our abilities. NPR reported around 3:30 a.m. the Kerrville City manager Dalton Rice said he was out for an early morning jog along the Guadalupe River and saw not a drop of rain, according to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. Not sure why that is relevant. Seems like being on the Canada not worrying about because you didn't see it hit the iceberg. KXAN reported that Kirk County Judge Rob Kelly said he couldn't answer why camps weren't evacuated, but acknowledged we do not have a warning system. The Austin American Statesman reported that Kirk County Judge Rob Kelly also said we don't have the snow, the flood was coming. The Austin American Statesman reported that WNM Kidd, chief of the Texas Department of Emergency Management, said state leaders began alerting local officials Thursday about the potential for flash flooding. It does not look like the problem for reduced staffing for NUS or FEMA, however, for Kerrville officials not taking the warning seriously, as well as with not having a warning system in place. So whenever local government failure, reminiscent of the police standing in the school hallway in Uvalde while students were being shot, I don't know what it is about Texas, but it seems to me that the camp should have been evacuated as soon as 7 inches of rain was restricted. A lot of lives could have been saved. Camp Mystic is literally on the banks of the Guadalupe River. I would think that total moron could figure out that 7 inches of rain would be a problem. And I guess I would agree with that. Just because the government isn't good at the national level doesn't mean you should just blame the national level. The government at the national, local, and state level can all fail you in different ways, and that's important to remember. So I would personally agree with this post. I would say. Then we have signed merch and a photo op was all to exchange some Republican votes from yes or no to yes. Sell to each and every one, and that's for most of my mundane image 14. That looks like a tweet from Max Lugraf. Did you hear how it passed? 4 House Republicans changed their votes to yes after Trump gave them signed MAG hats and selfies. They got signed merch and a photo op. 17 million people lost healthcare. That's the trade. That's the Republican Party. And that just goes to show you how people will fold at the slightest bit of temptation or provocation. And as I said earlier, people will just will always say they're free thinkers, but then the narrative comes knocking at the door, and suddenly they'll do whatever the party says. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, just like Ukraine against Russia, the American colonies didn't prevail against the redcoats on their own, posted by Spare Simeon. That's a YouTube video from BBC Timestamp, the biggest myth about the American Revolution, from BBC Timestamp, and they added, as with the US and EU helping Ukraine today, it was France that made it possible for the colonies to win against the British Empire. And I would agree with that. And just because you want to be as self-sufficient as possible doesn't mean you shouldn't accept help from foreign allies. And I personally don't think the Americans should be sending military equipment to Ukraine. But ultimately, I think if the American people want to send voluntarily send money to Ukraine or weapons, they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to say if they don't want to. It's the same for France back in the day. If the French people back in the 1700s wanted to send money to the American colonies that would become the U.S., they should have been able to do so, but they shouldn't have been forced to do so if they didn't want to. Could that have cost the American Revolution? Would that have made it unsuccessful? Who knows? But I think that's very much the libertarian perspective, is each individual should be able to justify and make whatever decisions they want to without being forced by the state. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.